our small group had a really good conversation from that session. Good. So my talk is called Waking Up to Our Senses, Meditations on Justice from Younger Theologians in the Context of Ecumenism. So I'm coming in maybe a bit more of a practical angle, so I'm kind of starting thinking about a problem that I've observed, talking about how I failed to fix it with a team, and then I'm kind of thinking theologically about what the repercussions are of it and where maybe we can move forward in the conversation. A lot of what I'm talking about has come from my new edited book that Andy has kindly brought with him, called Awake, Emerging and Connected, Meditations on Justice from a Missing Generation, kindly supplied by the URC Bookshop, my favourite supplier. This book is a follow-on from my 2021 book called Young, Woke and Christian, which was really, in the British context, focused about how it's a bit tricky to be a young person and a Christian and care about lots of justice issues, especially in the context of COVID, where the conversation was just about a missing generation. Kind of felt like we were invisible, and like the church was so convinced that we weren't there and wanting to bring other people in, that the people that were there were just not important and were marginalised. Or they were like a fix to bring other young people in. And so their actual kind of presence and bodies were overlooked. This one is maybe more of a challenge, also to younger people in Britain to like see our privilege, and also to kind of want the younger generation to be more global in our outlook, of understanding that the church is vibrant and growing in other places across the world, yet the way we think about church in the UK is still so UK focused. So it's brought in authors from different disciplines, from different places around the world to think about justice. In relation to like real life issues, kind of like trauma, and thinking about like Palestinian liberation, thinking about the disappearances in Mexico, kind of all of these big issues, hopefully in an accessible and fun way. So to start today, I'm thinking I'm going to start in the UK. I'm starting with our ecumenical body churches together in England. So if I can do the next slide. CTE rejected the nomination of the fourth president due to her being in a same-sex marriage on the 22nd of November 2019. Hannah Roke-Womack is a young Quaker woman and a committed Quaker, and she was elected by her presidency group. Previous to her nomination, the presidency group looks like this. If you go to the next slide already. All men. Churches Together in England was formed in 1990 after the Swanwick Declaration that divided the previous ecumenical instrument in Britain, the British Council of Churches, that was inaugurated by William Temple in 1952, where he famously proclaimed eventual unity over violence in the height of World War II. It was quite a prolific, prophetic moment. I'm going to return later in this talk why I think this move that happened here in 1990 was a mistake. But for now, I'm going to return to Hannah. So maybe we can go back one.
Oh, back one. Oh.
Well, we can say that actually, because I'm going to do that next. No, that's fine. Oh, that was perfect. So Churches Together in England currently has 52 member churches. So in 2019 it had 49 member churches, and it only had 20 when it was founded. Some of them will be quite familiar, like the Church of England, of course, the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, the Salvation Army, the Methodist Church, Baptist Union, URC. But the majority of the churches in the ecumenical movement, CTE, actually might be less known to us all, such as the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Diocese in the British Isles and Islands, which joined in 2009, or the Unification Council of Cherubim and Seraphim Churches, the Europe chapter, which actually was a founding member church, or the God of Prophecy, which joined in 2005, or the Redeemed Christian Church of God from Nigeria, which joined in 2007. From 1990, these churches in England have been grouped into 6 presidency groups. So they're represented by the Archbishop of Canterbury for the Church of England, so at the moment that's Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Westminster, who represents the Roman Catholics, one of the Orthodox archbishops, sorry, I'm making a little rotation, any Pentecostal or charismatic representative, and a Free Churches representative. This group includes the Baptist, Methodist, and URC, and it's now Tessa, Henry Robinson, so that's cool. And then finally, there's this fourth presidency group, which is where Hannah was elected from. And this includes the Quakers, the Church of Scotland and England, and the Lutheran churches, and a few others. So the presidents already, we can see, aren't equal in this system. So the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church are unfairly platformed. Two of the presidents are very unlikely to be women. Two more are quite unlikely to be women. And it's also unlikely that the person platformed by the Church of England, until the Archbishop of Canterbury hopefully inevitably is a woman in the future, or the Roman Catholic Church, or the Orthodox churches, is questioned as a legitimate appointment. It's very unlikely that other churches will question the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? A young woman, however, from a church which does not ordain people, is quite an easy target. Already, in these preliminary conversations, a few churches moved presidency groups, so they went from the fourth presidency group to the Pentecostal and charismatic group to allow Hannah to take up her appointment when they felt that Hannah couldn't represent them in the group. Because they wanted to uphold that it was the turn of the Quakers to elect somebody, which is the fairness of how that group functions. So all of this went on, and the controversy was because Hannah's in a same-sex relationship. But in a press release, what really touched me was Hannah saying, and now we can go to the next slide, I wasn't sure if I was willing or able to accept the nomination. It took a lot of heart-searching to be able to say yes. I had a conversation with a member of the nominations group about the fact that if this really was such a high-profile role, my activism, including arrestable actions like blockades against nuclear weapons and the arms trade, may raise eyebrows. I was, naively, more worried about how my conscience-driven civil obedience might go down in the ecumenical world than about my sexuality. I assumed my upcoming marriage might be uncomfortable for some, but never dreamed it would cause the furor that it did. It was at the enabling group, where historically churches have waved through the presidents as a matter of courtesy, that the presidency for the first time became a subject of discussion for the member churches. In a press release by CTE, it was explained that while remaining committed to the journey of unity, we are honest churches from many traditions. The member churches of CTE, through the enabling group, have recently requested the fourth presidency group to refrain from enacting its presidency at this time, leaving the fourth presidency as an empty chair for the current term of office. In fact, after the majority of churches in the enabling group complained about Hannah, CTE asked the fourth presidency group to reappoint. This group refused and instead kept Hannah as convener of the fourth presidency group, where decisions were made collectively, and that an empty chair, they asked, would always be physically present where the presidents gathered, to symbolise the hurt of this non-appointment. At the end of Hannah's term, the Quakers asked for photos to be sent to them of the presidents with the empty chair. CTE replied that they couldn't, because no such photo existed. Hannah reflects how she had done all of the internal work of the CTE presidency, but had been excluded from any kind of public-facing role. Following the decision, there were member churches such as the URC, URC Youth, the Methodist Church, and individual congregations and charities that expressed their disappointment at the decision. And after writing and publishing a letter from URC Youth, I was asked to become a trustee of CTE. I'm just coming to the end of my 3 years of trusteeship now, and I lament that I don't think that CTE has got any further with this conversation. One of my first tasks as a trustee was to evaluate the presidency. So myself, the General Secretary, who at the time was an Evangelical Baptist minister and biblical theologian, a Roman Catholic bishop, and a pastor from the Charismatic Fellowship, we all decided that after multiple meetings, in the absence of Hannah, the presidency should be paused until the time for the fourth presidency seat to be re-elected. The enabling group rejected our suggestion. Maybe one positive that's come out of all of this is that the Pentecostal and charismatic churches ran their own conference on sexuality. And CTE has since tried to host conversations around sexuality, but many key denominations are not attending the conversations. And no person in a same-sex relationship is represented in these conversations. But neither am I sure that they were safe to be, and I got into a lot of trouble for saying this, but I don't think that space would be safe for them to be part of that conversation. So I've really jumped in here already with the case study, but I wanted to use this to elaborate how normal injustice has become in our churches. How can we possibly move towards justice for our queer siblings if not even the metaphor of an empty chair can be upheld in their honour? I'm now going to use some other young voices to consider how we might wake up the ecumenical movement and the churches to move towards something akin to reconciliation. But first, let's think a little bit deeper theologically into what's going on here with the fourth presidency scandal. Wait, great. So point number one, obviously there's an injustice towards a gifted young woman who's not being able to fulfill her calling and share her gifts from a unique church and give and challenge this diverse body of churches. The predecessor of Churches Together in England, the British Council of Churches, had no presidency, and the other movements in Wales, Scotland and Ireland, they also don't have presidents. So the abolition of the presidency, which is what I originally wanted and kept banging on about, would have been possible, but it's been sacralised as this false tradition, and a pure hierarchical structure, that was at risk of infection. The theology of the ecumene that As Together Towards Life document explains from the CWME of the World Council of Churches, the church as the communion of Christ's disciples must become an inclusive community and exist to bring healing and reconciliation to the world is at odds with this decision. This relates to point 3. Some of the churches who protested against Hannah's appointment were those with links to the global south, and these churches argued that the decision would disrupt their global relationships. I would point to research from people like Adrian Van Klinken at the University of Leeds to better understand the complexity of sexual diversity in especially Africa, which is usually used as a scapegoat, and the pain that decisions in Africa are causing LGBTQ Christians. But I also would like to point out that ecumenism can't be governed by fear of the other or fear of repercussions and what might happen. We all need to be authentically and fully ourselves for real relationships to work and recognise the diversity within even our own churches. Point 5, so this is a misunderstanding of representation in ecumenism. There are already 6 presidency groups, pointing to the 6 types or categories of ecclesiology or theology that supposedly can be grouped together. So it was churches in these other 5 groups, and not the churches specifically that moved away from the 4th presidency group, who prevented Hannah from taking this presidency. Not one person can represent the whole ecumenical organisation, and this is part of the reason why the British Council of Churches moved towards this current Churches Together model, to better show diversity of churches, ideas, bodies and theologies in ecumenism. Some church leaders pointed to a sinful lifestyle or the threat of their unity with churches in their fellowship abroad as to why Hannah could not take her seat. And these churches threatened to leave the CTE partnership. But I would like to argue that Hannah's role was to represent the 4th presidency group, and only the 4th presidency group, not the whole body of Christians. So this argument is actually a misunderstanding of representation in and of the purpose of unity, which is not to make each disciple in church look, act and believe the same. And this 5th point here, the 6th point, I can't count. The 6th point here, this ignoring and dismissing the full theology and gifts of inclusive denominations. If Hannah can't take the seat as a dedicated friend, how can any other Quaker with this shared theology, possibly in the fullness of their faith, do the same? How can any inclusive church be fully represented in this ecumenical instrument? This was really on my mind when I was thinking about taking up the trusteeship of CTE, but I decided that I couldn't be sure that another young person or a woman or anyone with an inclusive theology would be asked if I refused the appointment. Not only have queer people, but all people hold expansive theologies have been denied their seat at the table. We've all been asked to show restraint and not bring our whole selves or our whole theologies to us to ecumenical conversations. To draw again from Together Towards Life, which was published in 2013, it quotes, "Among the surprises of the Spirit are ways in which God works from locations which appear to be on the margins and through people who appear to be excluded. This is actively excluding." So what can unity mean if we can't bring our whole selves into the conversation? How can it be anything other than a PR scheme if it's not true, accepting, or authentic? I wonder how we should, or perhaps should have already responded to this scandal. And I want to reaffirm here that I don't expect all 52 member churches to agree on the issue of sexuality. At some point in the kingdom we will, but perhaps, that's an expectation that we shouldn't be having. Churches are currently busy tearing themselves apart on the question of human sexuality, let alone in ecumenical circles. But I do think here that the proposed issue is not unique. It's not the first, and it's not the most significant barrier to unity that we have had at all. So I want to present a dialogue between two men who are both gay that have written chapters in these two of my edited books to think about perhaps a way forward. So first up is Josh Mock. So which approach should we take to think about or reconcile this dilemma? So Josh studied Arabic and Persian. He's an accomplished musician, and until recently he's been the chair of the Student Christian Movement. And he wrote in my 2021 edited book, Young, Woke and Christian, a chapter entitled, and I really love this title, "Queer, Christian and Tired, Why I'm No Longer Talking to Cis-Het Christians About Sexuality." Queer, Christian and Tired, Why I'm No Longer Talking to Cis-Het Christians About Sexuality, which is a play on Rennie Eddo-Lodge's best-selling 2017 book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. So Josh began his chapter by recalling the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which is acronym ACTA, protest in St. Paul's Cathedral in New York on the 10th of December 1989. That morning, during Mass, a crowd of 4,500 protesters coalesced around the cathedral. They chanted, "You say don't fuck, we say fuck you." Inside, activists handed out... Sorry, Andy, for the recording. Inside, activists handed out decoy orders of service containing information about ACT UP and HIV prevention. The zenith of the protest was the silent dying. As the Cardinal began his homily, protesters lay in the aisle, representing nearly 60,000 Americans who had died of AIDS. ACT UP member Michael Petrelis took things a step further, and he stood on a pew, blew a whistle and shouted, "You're killing us." Another member, Tom Keane, was more daring. As he received communion from the Cardinal, he said, "Opposing same-sex education is murder," before desecrating the host, crumbling it into pieces and dropping it to the floor. I think coming from a Reformed ecclesiology, perhaps you don't understand how dramatic and how painful that move was. Where in obviously Roman Catholic theology that this is Christ, an argument that could be made is he there was putting himself above Christ in the communion, and his kind of activist above kind of the importance of Christ's body. But I think the point that was being made, which needs to be upheld, was that this was someone saying that he was not able he's not able to receive Christ's body in the ecclesiology of the church. There's a kind of similar example that I'll use later that maybe will help us interpret this one. So Josh, after telling this story, posed, "I can't help," we can do this, you're so good at this. "I can't help but feel that our current approach to queer ecclesial liberation has become too decent and lost the powerful actions like those of our queer elders at St. Patrick's Cathedral," St. Patrick's Cathedral, "and elsewhere had. We have moved away from protest, disruption and acting up, and instead focus on more acceptable forms of campaigning, for example through dialogue with our oppressors. We take part in facilitated discussions discussion with those who hold opposing views to us, as if queer identities are up for debate, to try and find common ground or ways to disagree well. Audre Lorde, in her 1980 Sister Outsider, called this a constant drain of energy, which she thought might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. Similarly, when we think about queer theology, Josh points to R.L. Reid, Isherwood, who together warn, terrible is the fate of theologians from the margin when they want to be accepted by the centre. Because such a desire presents queerness as something to be apologised for and in need of justification rather than being celebrated. Queer theology as apologetics or an apology for otherness loses its liberative purpose. Josh calls instead for transgressive activism and resistance, and ends his chapter with, "Queer Christians are tired. We're tired of hearing monologues about us from cis-hets in the church with no lived experience of queerness, or the rejection and the oppression we experience because of our sexuality. We're tired of compromising on the full celebration of queer lives so that the church can hold on to its social power, choosing to keep everyone happy, or at least placated, rather than siding with the oppressed and marginalised, the ones who usually get the worst end of the deal. We're tired of waiting for reform in the church while seeing ourselves further marginalised and oppressed. I'm tired and there's nothing left to talk about. That's why I'm no longer talking to cis-het Christians about sexuality." Secondly, conversely, a different approach in the second book comes from David Brandon Smith. David is ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA and is currently finishing his PhD studies at the University of Bonn in Germany. David's married to his partner Chan. His chapter in the edited book, Awake, Emerging and Connected, Meditations on Justice from a Missing Generation, thinks about the same topic with potentially, unfortunately, a less catchy title, but we couldn't figure something more easy. This is my story, this is my song, queer Presbyterians, provocative questions, practical politics, and a case for church history and the development of theologies of justice. I won't repeat that one. David's chapter explores the politics of the Presbyterian Church USA, and especially how the denomination overcame racism and sexism to help us think about the future for LGBTQ+ people in churches. David concludes that history is a tool for liberation and could be used to reclaim spaces and bring transformation. He held up brave individuals who create these kairos moments, the moments of crisis, such as David Bailey Saint from 1940 to 86, who post-ordination came out as gay, but he was denied his pastoral charge. He stood up at the 1974 General Assembly on his chair and held up a poster that asked the question, "Is anyone else out there gay?" David, however, concluded in a direct argument to Josh's that the next 50 years of debate and conversation were just as important as this brave move by Saint. The persistent practice of ministries of presence, David argues, calculated political manoeuvring, and a willingness to delve into the minutiae of policy, law, and the church's history of complex but often brave questioning of social norms, linked with uncomfortable compromises, the endurance of soul-crushing setbacks, and a willingness to entertain and rebut offensive questions, changed my church. I can say from experience that these practices are changing other communions as well. Though few of the church's most influential provocateurs espoused graduate schemes, many of their queries took decades or even centuries to answer in the affirmative. And each of the answers given is undermined by the schisms that accompanied them. David ends his chapter by saying, "It is time to stop yielding our claim on the Christian tradition and its claim on us to those who would suggest we are doing something entirely new. It's time to debunk the myths and reclaim our place in the history of the church's self-questioning as we continue working within our communities to embrace transformative theologies of justice." So we've got one approach asking for dissent and disruption, and we've got another that's asking for patience and persistence. both reactions too potentially applicable to the current very long ecumenical winter, as coined by Conrad Razor, who was the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. And both have support from historical study. So we can think of the youth protests in the 1968 World Council of Churches Uppsala Assembly, where young people argued for better representation of other young people, indigenous people and women, and held the World Council of Churches to account on the great decisions. This assembly is called the Social Assembly, the assembly where the World Council of Churches understood itself as being part of the world. It held it to account. A second in this protest model might be, there's a slide for that one, but these slides are going to go through quite quickly. But that's that one. It's a nice picture. Okay, this is James Baldwin. So James Baldwin, the black theologian and creative and educator, gave a talk at the WCC Uppsala Assembly, and there's an argument that the young people kind of bringing the movement of protest allowed him to be received well. A second example might be Alan Brozick, I love this story in Silvan, who gave a profound challenge to the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, which today is the World Communion of Reformed Churches, where Bozak refused to take communion with white folks when he couldn't in his own country, where he was under apartheid in South Africa. So this action and the Bible studies that he delivered at the 1982 Assembly and the previously drafted Belhar Confession allowed the Reformed Communion to declare a status confessionis, that apartheid was heresy and racism was a sin. Conversely, for David's model, we could think of the World Council of Churches Programme to Combat Racism, launched in 1969, that caused controversy but persevered towards justice. Or the Decade in Solidarity with Women in the WCC. I've got a slide for this one. Never mind, that's not. Yeah, we'll just go with that something. That pushed the. Pardon? Yeah, that's not. Sorry, I got them wrong around. That pushed the global communion to have these previously avoided conversations about women's ministry, flourishing, or safety. Or maybe we could talk about the Blood Money campaign from some brave individuals and abolitionist societies in the Free Church of Scotland from around 1844, documented well by Ian White. Although today the cost is only equivalent to about £3,000, these people campaigned ardently for the Free Church to send back the money raised from visiting the Presbyterian churches in the southern states of the US, whose membership included owners of enslaved peoples. So maybe there's pros and cons of each model. Charismatic leaders distract from resistance and from movement. James Cone explores a provocative quote from Malcolm X, who explained the danger of the good-intentioned white liberal who can see both sides and wants change without risk, whilst keeping their privilege of whiteness. The good-intentioned individual can mask the layers of pain in resistance of the oppressed, and there's a risk that they can pacify the movement. Their communication, by being easily digestible by the white masses like them, takes away the absolute brutality of the oppression in the first place, and narrates the story from the safe distance of whiteness, to be heard but maybe not listened to, not real enough to really change people. And also, who we remember and who is listened to is significant. Emma Wildwood has written a biography of the well-regarded in his time but humble Ugandan missionary who was active in the northern Great Lakes regions of Eastern Africa, Apollo Kibibulaya, active from 1865 to 1933. Wildwood questions the rebuttal of Kibibulaya's status as a pioneer for African Anglican Christianity shortly after his death, that stemmed from his willingness to work with and aid white, often colonial missionaries. Today he's largely forgotten from popular memory in both East Africa and today because he doesn't fit an easy power analysis between African and European missionaries. Wildwood's extensive research on this individual demonstrates how reception of the heroic is tightly intertwined with context, or in Kibibulaya's case, context and receptions. So it shouldn't be surprising that heroes, prophetic activists, or protest movements do not stand the test of time, and that their reception changes between beliefs. Conversely, justice issues also bear the risk of becoming just one program amongst another, when they become systematic, long-term organisational schemes. They can lose energy and begin relying on the few members of perhaps paid staff for the jobs rather than the collaboration of many. This might be familiar to a lot of us working in churches. Perhaps this is more a reflection of our current impatient postmodern society. But as churches and church people find themselves overstretched and overworked and battling a new church presence in the West and new relationships of power in ecumenical movements, balancing all the tasks, let alone doing the tasks, can become a job on its own. But there's also a problem of churches being stakeholders. So Alan Bozak made such an impression at the World Alliance of Reformed Communion Assembly because ecumenists were able to platform him. With churches as the stakeholders in control, will these prophetic voices be able to hold the platform? Does having a church-centric theology of ecumenism stifle and prevent prophetic voices? Does it numb the senses of churchgoers, not having the opportunity or perhaps willingness to be involved in ecumenism because their church hierarchy is? So how are we in this pickle? It was decided at the 1987 Interchurch Conference that the British Council of Churches should be replaced with the 4 national bodies. Churches together in England, churches together in Wales, team, Action of Churches together in Scotland, which is called the Scottish Church Leaders Forum, I think. Yeah. And the Irish Council of Churches, and the binding Churches Together in Britain and Ireland kind of umbrella body. This did incorporate previously distant denominations, which we have to celebrate, like the Roman Catholic Church, and more Pentecostal and African-initiated churches joined. The reform of the BCC was also a reaction to criticisms that it acted as a body and an authority beyond the churches. CTBI has been criticised for losing influence on the national church scene and in the public square, and the loss of a collective voice through an organised body has been lamented by some ecumenists. The national ecumenical movements had to find new meaning, and it settled with the idea of becoming a facilitator or an instrument for the churches, sacrificing much public influence for the sake of cohesion. The new vision declared that councils would have no authority to speak on the church's behalf, but would instead work to enable and facilitate ecumenical projects stemming from the churches themselves. A good example of where this worked might be the Dunblane House that Ian Fraser ran in Scotland, which kind of brought lots of ecumenists and kind of people together, and they did these like hard kind of study conferences.
Before 1990.
Oh, it's before 1990, right, but that would be a model where kind of this maybe would have worked, but I think we can say with some of these models, especially CTE now, this kind of hard work of bringing people together and having this discussion isn't happening. So this processing of transition, named Beyond 1984, also alienated young people. So the student Christian movement were invited to participate in the transitional discussion, but the delegated students returned from the discussion feeling, I quote, sad and angry. Their written contribution they felt was ignored, their leadership skills denied by the view that only church leaders could fill the role of ecumenists, and they felt it was set with an outdated agenda which failed to notice all that had been happening in the student revolution of the 60s and 70s. The British church scene seemed content with superficial ecumenism, as Keith Clements reflected. The last CTE Forum, the biggest event for the 52 member churches and associated bodies, actually forgot to invite the student Christian movement. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I and others like Robin Boyd and Adrian Hastings have written about how the ecumenical movement was basically designed by, inspired by, and upheld by the student movements. So this forgetting is actually a major institutional danger. This reform was successful in the sense that the bodies are more diverse. The integration of newer churches into ecumenical discussions, however, has sometimes been viewed as a hindrance towards becoming towards institutional union. The national church scene in Britain has recently seen an unprecedented influx of non-traditional denominations. A recent University of Aberdeen PhD, for instance, found that 61% of new churches in Glasgow founded between 2001 and 2016, were ethnic majority churches. 61% of new churches were ethnic majority churches. 56% of these identifying as Pentecostal, and 79% of these as African majority congregations. So the Redeemed Christian Church of God attracts more than 45,000 worshippers every year to its London-based Festival of Life event. So the acknowledgement of these non-traditional churches by the ecumenical scene makes the creation of a national common voice and shared ecclesial vision much harder. That doesn't mean it's not important, but it does make it much harder. Yet the churches nervous with their own flourishing can often strangle prophetic statements. Part of the rationale to turn away from the BCC model was to equalise power in the ecumenical movement and move away from having ecumenical experts. These experts in ecumenism, however, I think we can argue have been replaced by ecclesial experts, who in representing their sending denominations have only their church's best interest at heart. With every involved person in the ecumenical body working to advance the mission of their own church, a unity in heart, mind and action is hard to produce. For instance, CTE after the October 7 attack in Gaza, they made a statement by the president, and it was simply, I quote, this is a statement, "We pray for the Middle East." I was challenged by the saying something was better than nothing, because I'm not sure whether this statement of nothing was worth putting out at all. And let me show you the statements from CTE on the British riots. I think I have this one on the slide. Yeah. I quote, "In the wake of the terrible events in Southport, we acknowledge the anger felt by many at these senseless killings. We also acknowledge deep and troubling anxiety about immigration. Regrettably, we have witnessed violent racist attacks and intimidation on our streets. Who's the stakeholder here? Who's being placated? The ecumenical movement cannot be agreeable to everyone as its final aim, but it needs to be true to the gospel. As the URC statement proclaims, people fleeing from threats and persecution in other places should be able to find a safe place in the UK. As Christians, we're called to care for vulnerable people and speak up for those who suffer." And bishops in the Southwark Diocese of London independently declared, "We stand with people of peace from all faiths and men, and we commit ourselves to working together to challenge racism and hatred wherever we find it. Jesus himself was a refugee, and the commitment to welcoming the stranger, uplifting the downtrodden, and supporting the marginalised lies at the very heart of our faith. We are ready and willing to offer support and care for those from any community or background who have been affected or feel scared by what's happening." So the way forward. The ACRA Confession of the WCRC bravely states that unity and justice can't be divorced. It also proclaims, "We humbly confess this hope, knowing that we, too, as churches, stand under the judgment of God's justice. There is a need to subject ourselves to scrutiny with the humility of knowing that we as churches also make mistakes. This scrutiny needs to come from both other churches and, more importantly, from voices that are not easily heard inside of churchly or institutional structures." I'm going to go back towards Together Towards Life, because this is really helpful for me in meditating in this presentation. In each generation, the church must renew its commitment to evangelism as an essential part of the way we convey God's love to the world. How can we proclaim God's love and justice to a generation living in an individualised, secularised and materialised world? I mean, my criticism of this might be that I don't want to divide millennials and Gen Z with other old people, but I think we're all complicit in this neo-capitalist divided world, churches, peoples and world with God. But surely this meeting of fellow disciples should invoke a desire for closer fellowship, togetherness and work for the kingdom. The kind of hard work that actually works through different ideas and says something substantial, maybe even revolutionary, to a divided world. Because our alternative vocation and our hope for the world is that it will be one where all are welcome, all are treated well, and all can flourish with the life force of and the spirit in God's good creation. So we unequivocally have to affirm that every life is precious and every life is worth our effort, no matter the risk to our own stature or position. And no matter how geographically or culturally far away, those lives are just as precious as the ones closer to home. The dominant culture wants us to disconnect and to be unsure about our credentials to speak against the injustice in today's world. Chomsky, who is one of today's best-known public intellectuals, when asked about his ability to speak into world affairs, answered, "I think the idea that you're supposed to have special qualifications to talk about world affairs is just another scam. It's just another technique for making the population feel like they don't know anything, and they better just stay out of it and let some smart guys run it. In order to do that, what you pretend is that there's some esoteric discipline and you've got some letters after your name before you can say anything about it. That is a joke." I like how empowering this quote from Chomsky is and how relevant it is to this theme. It's abhorrent that ecumenism has been snatched away from the hands of the young, vibrant justice seekers and given to security-seeking church leaders. Is inclusivity in the ecumenical movement just a PR exercise, or are the voices of the young, women, refugees, lay, indigenous, disabled peoples not the voices to lead the movement? The authenticity of sitting with and fighting for the powerless and vulnerable is the vision that captures young people in churches. The role of the ecumenical movement is not to be agreeable to the churches, but to transform the churches to be able to participate in God's transforming of the world. The irresistible promise will not be found hiding in church corners, but on the streets of our scandalous world. At the last WCC assembly in Germany, a young Palestinian woman, Yasmina Rishmari, a member of the Palestine Sabeel Liberation Theology Movement, and a member and executive committee member of the World Student Christian Federation, was not able to speak. The WCC corrected most of the text that she wrote. Over 3 days, they were negotiating the final draft. Finally, in a meeting with the WCC, Yasmina decided not to talk, since her whole text was dismantled and some wording was prohibited from being included. Why might young people be a breath of hope? Iona Curtius explores in the Awake, Emerging and Connected book how young people have moved towards something called a meta-modern hope, a place of in-between, not sitting in despair, but not quite sitting in optimism, but an acknowledgement of necessity. I think this one's on the slide. It's quite small, sorry. This generation, our people, young people, yearn for hope. We long to be told that it's going to be okay. At the same time, we reject platitudes and the easy comfort of those who would tell us to close our eyes to the outside world and forget our troubles. Our world is burning, literally and figuratively. It's not okay. Nothing is okay. We are afraid. We are angry and scared, paralysed by the overwhelming need. Where do we even begin? Yet this generation do not give up. Crippled with climate anxiety, they take to the streets on Fridays. They proclaim boldly, "I can't breathe," holding clenched fists aloft. They confront late-stage capitalism in bright pink plastic commercials. They undermine cisgender, heteropatriarchal power structures with quirky and dark art. All these actions are bound together by a similarity. Yes, they are acts of resistance characterized by a determination grown out of desperation, but more than that, they are riddled with contradiction. Despair is an attempt to preempt disappointment, to protect ourselves from the vulnerability of our ontological need for hope. Such an attempt, however, is misguided, even dangerous. For in this so-called realism dictated by the facts, we fall victim to the worst of all utopias, the utopia of the status quo. Realism or despair accepts the status quo. It declares it immutable and asks us to give up ideas of a better world, and thus prevents us from taking action against injustice. Hope stands against this, and Gentry writes that hope must be an active resistance to injustice anywhere and at any time, to be determined by those with need, not by those with power. In Ethics of Hope, the 8-year-old Moltmann writes that it's not tragedy or disappointment that destroy hope, as realism or despair would suggest, but lethargy is the real enemy of hope. Ziona writes, we can't just jump from modern certainty to meta-modern hope. If we don't go through a process of deconstruction or wintering, then we're not going to understand metamodernism and won't be able to learn from or contribute to it. We'll fail to understand young people, and worst of all, will continue to betray them, us, by misinterpreting and undermining our hopes and passionate charges towards a better and more just world. I just read a book by a famous Japanese author that I'd really recommend, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawara. Without wanting to give away the whole story, the memory police erase things from roses to ferries and boats, and people are contained almost to accept these disappearances, and after a short while they can't even remember them when the object is placed back in front of them. All feelings of warmth or desire are erased for most, but a few people remember and they have to hide from the memory police. It makes me wonder if we're being conditioned to forget that the ecumenical movement was developed from young people who wanted to see beyond the boundaries of their own denomination and wanted to learn from other young people, and with other young people seek out the most exciting and radical voices in contemporary theology and missional thought at the time. That these young people were the pioneers of the missionary movement, wanting to take the gospel to people who many still thought were beyond the saving grace of God and not worth their time and effort. And then later, the same body of students who in the 1950s, they decided to completely change their missional paradigm. They apologised for coloniality and patriotism in the organisation, and they stopped their traditional overseas ministry through their student arms. The history of the student Christian movement is best documented by Robin Boyd, and he named it the church ahead of the church. It's quite prophetic talking about this here, actually. This place has been quite important for kind of student Christian movements for generations. And I think more work needs to be done on creating a larger history that unites the student movements across the world. So to go back to the two paradigms by David and Josh, I think that we do need both to disrupt the ecumenical movement and keep it moving. Better global diversity in the ecumenical movement is by far its biggest success and change. So WCC, for instance, the World Council of Churches, has grown from only 30 of 147 member churches being from Africa, Asia, and Latin America in 1948. Today having 349 member churches being from 8 regions, representing more than 115 countries. Kirsten Kim reminds us that the WCC was a product of the colonial view. It presumed that unity beyond the historic denominations of Europe would, largely in and of itself, unify Christians globally. And I think that's a challenge for us today, whereas pre-1980s, the conversations around traditional unity in the UK involved only 4 or 5 denominations, and today we've got 52. This kind of world ecumenical stage has descended on the UK, which I think needs to make us question what unity in the UK looks like, because it means unity for the world. We now see the obvious folly from the churches in China, India, and the Pacific. They unified much more easily than churches in the West. The ecumenical movement has listened to and integrated post-colonial voices, but it must be brave enough to venture into a process of decolonisation. A larger representation of voices is a good start, but we also have to interrogate how current structures allow academia, power, implicit influence, and historical legacies to still set the agenda. And perhaps more significantly, what to leave off the agenda. The ecumenical movement must question all aspects of what it considers normal, and must also recognise and call out the negative implications of powerful church structures. Being invited to the table also doesn't automatically manifest in being fully represented, and some minoritized people are still unable to take their seats and have their voices heard. This isn't only just physical participation, but methods of ecumenical engagement are also creating barriers for ecumenism the last Faith and Order document that asked for replies didn't have any replies from Latin America or Africa. So this tricky question here of what representation means also when our own congregations, let alone denominations, are so diverse, and where our media and contexts are becoming more and more politically and culturally divided in our climate of global neo-capitalism is significant. Let's just skip this a little bit. So to wrap up, what I think I'm trying to argue is that the ecumenical movement needs to open up a space of inclusivity, creativity, imagination, risk-taking, investment and trust into the marginal people. So the young people, the believers, the activists, and those as recorded in Acts 2. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see vision, and your old men will dream dreams. When we can trace the ecumenical movement to groups of young people meeting each other at a time when nonconformist traditions and Anglican traditions couldn't worship together, let alone share the sacraments legally, with a genuine curiosity and desire to change the world. The catchphrase, the evangelization of the world in this generation, and make Jesus king, inspired and activated generations of young people to give their lives to ecumenical work and the missionary movement. Albeit that the theology of the catchphrase is not aged very well, where this declaration in light of Missio Dei is presupposing that God wasn't already at work in the places that it was like that God wasn't already there and that the people had the power, etc. The theology is terrible. But their enthusiasm and following of how they interpreted God's word to the context of their time pushed, challenged, and ultimately changed their churches and the relationships between them beyond recognition. So to really finish now, I know that those of us with a heart for ecumenism, a heart for fellowship and friendship, for reconciliation, evangelism, a vision of God's dream for the world, I still have computer, are finding the world and our contacts quite tough at the moment. But I think we need to remember that we have a duty to expose the fallacy of hopelessness and to continue to carve out a space for listening and drawing people closer to God and God's world. Ecumenism has enabled God to be heard in the most unlikely of places, and we will pledge to continue to seek for God's voice today. I just want to end by my favourite quote from Bonhoeffer. The meaning of present events is chaos, disorder, and catastrophe. And in resignation or pious escapism, they surrender all responsibility for reconstruction and for future generations. It may be that the day of judgment will dawn tomorrow. In that case, we shall gladly stop working for a better future, but not before.